Welcome everyone to a new lecture in the framework of our course in Positive Political Economy 2, where we discuss about group decisions, we discuss about collective action problems, we discuss about institutions and public policy with applications to the European Union. Today we've got a very special guest with us. His name is Fabio Franchino. He's full professor of political science at the University of Milan in Italy, and he's an expert in the executive politics of the European Union in delegation and control. Today he will discuss with us a little bit about these issues, about executive discretion, control, and how lawmakers delegate some executive powers to the European Commission and how they also try to control the exercise of those powers. Welcome, Fabio.
Thank you very much. Welcome to everybody. And thank you, Diego, for your invite. It's a pleasure to be here.
Okay, Fabio. Today we are doing some experiments. We've got many students watching live. You can see the chat if you like here. They are writing already on the chat. Thank you everyone for your presence. Denisa, Andrei, Vlad, Joanna, Lavinia, Bianca, Alice, Delia, Georgiana, Andrea, Ion, Madeline, Sabina, Dumitru, Raffaela, Delian, Rodica, Tudor, Marius, Lazar. Many students are connected and are writing on the chat. So I will start with the topic that we have selected for today is a general one, right? But I would like to ask you about you first as an introduction, to tell us a little bit about your research interests and how I know probably some students may know already if they have had any other lecture with you. You are an expert in executive politics. You are the author of the book, The Powers of the Union, published by Cambridge University Press, which is specifically about the executive power in the European Union. What are your current research interests? What are you doing lately? Tell us a little bit, just as an introduction, but not in order to make the students afraid, just give us a brief idea of the topics that interest you now.
Okay. Something along the similar lines of the executive politics and something new. Actually, last week, I submitted the final draft, let's say the first important draft of a book I've been working on since more or less 2014. And the title of the book is Balancing Pressures, the Politics of the European Union Economic Policy. So essentially it is the study of how the European Union manage the European economy, more or less. So it is a book that analyzes how economic ideas shape the European Union economic policy, how laws have been designed, the patterns of delegation in those laws as well. It's a work that studied then the adoption of what are called the country-specific recommendations, which are recommendations to implement different policies, and the excessive deficit procedure, which is a procedure which operates at the supranational level to oversee national spending. And essentially, it is a book that covered the full policy cycle of the European Union economic policy, from ideas to design of the law and bargaining, to design of the executive instruments, and then to compliance. It's also studied compliance at the national level and the effects and the consequences of supranational oversight of spending.
I'm very happy. Yes, I'm very happy that you are interested now in this topic, because we have had a few lectures about this in the past weeks. Exactly. We have discussed this policy coordination, the excessive deficit procedure, this European semester thing, and all this. I compare this to some kind of peer review. Is that right? Is this like peer review between the ministers of Europe?
Well, I mean, let's say that a part of it is because is called the preventive surveillance. It is a sort of let's say ministers in Europe, they recommend to each other what they should do in terms of economic policy. And then they tell the Commission to oversee whether if they actually comply or not with those recommendations. And then, let's say, if they misbehave, one could call it that way, they can open up a procedure, which is the excessive deficit procedure, in order to demand them to correct if they, if their budgets are not in line with the fiscal rules. So there is an element of peer pressure that is true, and that actually operates. I have to say that I mean, in terms of compliance, European countries are not doing particularly well. I mean, we study the determinants of compliance. There is significant variation. Some are doing better than others. But surprisingly enough, the excessive deficit procedure seems to operate. Countries do comply with the recommendation of the excessive deficit procedure.
I've got another question related to this, because it's a curiosity I have, and probably you can help. It's about this sanctioning procedure in the excessive deficit procedure. These fines have never been applied. There have been cases where France, Germany had excessive deficits and the fines were not applied. The new fiscal compact, this new treaty, seems to have inverted the burden now. Like the sanctions would be automatic instead of requiring qualified majority, and so it makes a little bit easier for sanctions to be applied, but still they have never been applied. So can they be applied or not?
I don't think actually that is, let's say, the problem with sanctions is that they might not necessarily be very credible. The reason is because there are financial sanctions on a country which is already in, let's say, fiscal difficulties. However, having said that, countries do actually reduce deficit when they are under the excessive deficit procedure. And actually, you might be surprised if I say that larger countries, they reduce their deficit more than smaller countries. And actually, they are more likely to be subject to the procedure than smaller countries. The reason is obvious, because fiscal profligacy in those countries has greater consequences across the Eurozone and the European Union than smaller countries. So probably, let's say, I'm not. It is hard to say whether those sanctions are credible or not, because you're right, they've never been used. However, there is likely to be peer pressure. There is probably likely that the fact that a country is under the excessive deficit procedure, it generates enough domestic cost, criticism from the media, criticism from the oppositions, that they do have an impact on the behavior of governments, regardless of the presence of sanction at the supranational level. So I don't think there is a sanction that actually drive the behavior of countries, the reaction of countries to this procedure. It is probably the fact that governments are criticized at the national level by the media, by opposition parties, and that actually leads governments to modify their behavior.
And so is it like it's like a shame that they are ashamed publicly within their own country?
There must be a mechanism of perceived electoral cost by being under excessive deficit. Clearly is criticism by the media or criticism by the opposition. So the countries are, governments react to that. That what seems to be the case, because you agree. I mean, the institutional design, I'm not sure whether it is actually credible or not. But clearly, at the national level, they do react, they do comply eventually. And I have to say, larger countries might be strange, but larger countries are more than smaller one in a way. And so it's a system that it works. It has problem, but to tell you the truth, it is relatively responsive to changes in the distribution of preferences within the council. For instance, probably rightly so, this procedure has been seen as enforcing austerity at the national level. It has been criticized for that reason. But for instance, the distribution of preferences within the country do have an impact on the likelihood of opening and closing the procedure. So whether the key minister is more on the left or on the right, they do have an impact on the likelihood of opening and closing. So in a way, it is a policy which is responsive, to the distribution of preferences of national governments, and which is, in my view, not too bad.
So could it be like, even they have never been applied, these sanctions, they work in a sense as nuclear weapons that have very, very rarely used, but they work as a deterrent?
They clearly, there might be, one can clearly make the argument that of strategic anticipation, right? I mean, since a member says strategically anticipate those that they will get sanctioned and then stay at that. Yes, that can be an argument that can be made, undoubtedly. Even though it is, let's say, it's in a way speculation because they've never been adopted. I'm inclined to think that there might be an interaction with the fact that there are sanctions and there are clearly electoral. Politicians react to electoral sanctions and electoral cost. I think those being under the excessive deficit procedures increases electoral cost in a way. So that's why governments tend to react. And also peer pressure. Do not underestimate the importance of peer pressure. These is our colleagues. They are foreign ministers sitting at our round table, which they understand that they are politicians, that they operate under electoral constraints and policy constraints, but they also say, we are in a common, we are having a common, we are sharing a currency. I understand you're facing specific electoral and policy pressures, but the way you're spending the money or the way the fiscal policy is operating might generate negative externalities also for your colleagues. In my view, that is likely to also to operate as a pressure. So it's a combination of those factors. Undoubtedly, the second one, it is related to the possibility of sanctions, because colleagues can say, well, after a while, if you continue to misbehave, you might be eventually sanctioned. So it is probably, it is likely to be a combination of both factors.
Okay, so the lecture in which we discuss this monetary and fiscal policies in Europe, it was entitled "The Tragedy of the Common Currency," right? Do you think that the fact that the ECB will eventually bail out countries in difficulty, you think it encouraged them to overspend?
Well, this is a classical moral hazard problem, no? I think politicians are fully aware of that, and they clearly can design institutions in order to avoid that sort of behavior. And to tell you the truth, also one part, the penultimate chapter in my book actually study the determinants of spending. And it is interesting because the factors that lead to overspendings are more or less the same that the factor that we saw prior to the 1990s. For instance, if there are many parties in government, there is an inclination to spend a bit more because there are many different interests that need to be served. In the proximity of an elections, governments tend to spend a bit more. So those are the classical political factors that lead to this sort of behavior. In my view, there is the root. I mean, it is true that if you bail out governments, that might lead to a moral hazard, undoubtedly. But clearly, legislators, central banks are aware of that. They can design instruments in order to avoid that sort of behavior. I mean, the way the New Generation EU Fund is designed, essentially what they did, they linked the delivery of money to the implementation of country-specific recommendation, essentially. Essentially, you need, you use stick and carrots, and you say, you know what? I mean, we can give you the money. We might even, I don't know about bailout, but we can, let's say, support you fiscally. But in exchange, you need to implement a set of measures. So that is a classical mechanism that has been used, and that might lead to the at least minimization of the risk of moral hazard. Even though, as I said, there are clearly political pressures. There are situations whereby governments decide to spend, but then those things, the dynamics is a phenomenon that lasts about 2 or 3 years, and then they tend to correct the dynamic of spending. That's what we observe. For instance, the opening on excessive deficit procedure, it doesn't really produce much in the first 2 years, but after 3 and 4 years, that's when governments start to correct the deficit. So it is a medium-term sort of behavior that we observe. And also in terms of moral hazard, I think the institution can be designed in order to minimize that risk.
So this correction, you say it takes like 3 years.
3 to 4, yeah.
3 to 4 years. Is this because it's already the next government that implements the recommendations? Because the governments stay in power not for so long; they stay for 4 years or so. Does this work through the change in the government?
That is a very good question. I didn't test that. That's actually an interesting. That is a very interesting, let's say, hypothesis that could be tested, which I haven't considered. What you're saying is that essentially, as they are under the excessive deficit procedure, there is a change on government, and that leads to a change in the fiscal policy. It could be. It could be. But I didn't think about that. I mean, that is okay. That is for the future research paper. Thank you for the idea, then, Diego.
Okay, good. Look, the topic today we have to discuss is related to this. It's about executive independence and executive supervision by the lawmakers, right? And the principal agent problem in general, bureaucratic drift, and these control mechanisms that lawmakers have in case of this drift. For instance, the adoption of new legislation, right? And in the case of the EU, is there any particularity about this? For instance, this kind of joint decision trap, or the fact that adopting new legislation is more difficult than in other systems makes it harder to control the executives?
Well, I mean, in terms of the difficulty of adopting laws, I mean, I would be hard-pressed to say that it's necessarily more arduous in the European Union compared, for instance, to the US. I mean, especially in the last 20 years, lawmaking in the US has been, it is so fraught by polarization and so on, which is almost impossible to adopt important laws in the US. Only in periods of unified government it is possible to adopt major laws, and then that's it. But periods of unified government are very rare, are relatively rare in the US. So, for instance, Whether it is more arduous in the European Union compared to the US, for instance, I wouldn't say that that's the case. Probably it is more arduous compared to European national governments, parliamentary systems, especially those which are governed by either by a single party or by small coalition, two-party coalitions. Clearly, in that case, it is easier to adopt laws. So I would say the European Union, in terms of the difficulty of adopting laws, is something in between the US and parliamentary system in Europe.
So you say the similarity with the US, where the executive, the president has a lot of autonomy, right? And yes, but the president there is directly elected by the people. In the case of the EU, the executive is appointed by lawmakers, right? Although the motion of censure procedure is more similar to the impeachment procedure in the US. So it's like it has the autonomy from the US, but it does not have the legitimacy of direct election by the people, right?
Yes, of course. I mean, it is indirectly elected, but the reason it is clear indirectly elected, and the only and the censor procedure is a rather arduous procedure. It is mostly for, let's say, non-political reasons. Mostly, you can replace the commission if they have violated the law, but not necessarily for strictly political reasons. Clearly, that's you cannot do that as well in presidential system, of course. But you're right. There might be a problem with the fact that is indirectly elected. However, let's say I would say that the European Union executive is clearly less powerful compared to compared to the US. And by the way, the US president has veto power on the legislation of Congress, while essentially the Commission has only proposal power, and that's it. So I wouldn't say that it's comparable on that from that perspective. If you wish, I can outline the dilemmas, the reason why powers are delegated at the national level, and what are the paths. Okay. So let me briefly. So if things are not clear, just interrupt me to clarify. Also, students. So I'll just briefly. So my idea was to talk about why powers are delegated in the context of the European Union. What are the risk of delegation, and then focus on what are the core delegating decisions in the European Union. And then, if we have time, there are two interesting topics, in a way, that developments in the European Union. One is the merging of agencies. Over the past 20 years, there's been a significant increase of agencies at the EU agencies, upon which important powers has been conferred. So they do start to play an important role, and also we have advances in the method of the study of studying how laws are designed, using, for instance, machine learning procedures. And if we have time, we might discuss a little bit about that, on how laws can be analyzed using machine learning. But before getting into these things which are slightly more advanced, why are powers delegated in general or in the European Union? Well, one reason is because you need, for instance, someone who set an agenda, or that has to lead a specific committee. Okay, that can be one reason. So if you need leadership and agenda setting, you might delegate power. So for instance, one of the traditional, let's say, legislative competences of the Commission is to make proposals. Okay, so that is a classical policy power which is delegated in the treaty. The other reasons, however, are far more, let's say, common in the context of the European Union. One is to ensure credible enforcement. So essentially, member states adopt laws together, and they face a dilemma when they have to implement those laws. Any dilemma which is very similar to a prisoner dilemma, which is, for instance, let's assume there are two countries, okay, the bunch of countries that decide to liberalize a market. And market liberalization, everybody might benefit out of market liberalizations, assuming that it's welfare enhancing. But then individually, some states, for whatever reason, some government for whatever reason, might have an incentive to say, you know what, you liberalize your market so that our exporting companies will benefit from that, but we'll keep our market closed so that our importing competing companies will be protected from competition. So there are strong incentives for, especially for this type of measure, for member states not to comply, essentially to protect your own import competing industries and to ensure to give opportunity to your exporting industries. So this is a classical. If everybody does that, a single market will collapse. Okay. So a reason why policies might be delegated to a supranational authority is to ensure credible enforcement. So you give to a supranational authorities the competence to monitoring and possibly sanctioning non-compliant behavior at the national level. So you attach some sort of a cost for non-compliance. So this is an important reason why sometimes policies are delegated. You delegate essentially enforcement prerogatives to supranational institutions like commissions, the Court of Justice, to discover non-compliance and to impose cost to non-compliance. Then there might be other reasons. Other reasons are very simple. It's because essentially sometimes you need to take a lot of measures, and if you want to reduce your workload, you delegate those decisions to bureaucrats. And another important reason is that you might need the expertise of a bureaucrat to implement a policy. Now, this is an interesting aspect because traditionally speaking, in my view, the policy expertise normally reside at the national level in Europe. I mean, national ministries are normally much more staffed, and the extent of policy expertise normally reside more at the national level than the supranational level. However, I have to say, over the past 20 years, and especially with the emergence of these agentification, so the development of new agencies, there is clearly a need to delegate powers more at the supranational level, really to take advantage of the expertise developed by these supranational agencies, in my view. So things have changed over time. So generally, you need to delegate when you need to rely on someone else's expertise. Traditionally, that expertise resides at the national level. Now, in my view, there is significant demand for expertise at the supranational level. So that's why quite a few agencies have been created at the supranational level.
So you have introduced the rationale, the reasons why the European Commission has been delegated so many executive powers by member states. For instance, this function that you mentioned of guardian of the treaties, to ensure that the treaties will be respected by all the signatures of the treaty. And you mentioned also this idea of expertise and the idea of agenda setting as well, to probably to provide stability, right?
Yes, exactly. Yes, I mean, it's I don't know whether you are aware of the concept of the Condorcet paradox or the policy cycles. So that's the idea of why you might want to delegate at least agenda setting power to a policy entrepreneur. That is a way to structure a little bit more the decision-making procedure and to avoid a risk of policy cycle whereby everybody makes up proposals and then essentially nobody decides. So that could be one reason of why you want to delegate agenda setting competencies. Yeah.
Okay. So the reason why I invited you also is not only because you are the world expert in the executive politics of the EU, it's also because you are from Italy, right? and Italy is a country of current interest for Europe, and it's a political system that's very different from the system of the EU. The system of Italy is not as stable as the system of the EU, but because we discussed this, what you just mentioned, these Condorcet cycles, the chaos theorems, and all these things, the Arrow's impossibility theorem. We discussed all these things in our course already, and I came with principle, right, for my students to be for them to remember better these main concepts, and I tell them that democracy is like the woman of Rigoletto, la donna è mobile, qual piuma al vento, muda d'accento e di pensiero. And the reason why Italy is more unstable is because Italy is more democratic than the EU. What do you think?
Okay. Well, that's depends very much on what you mean by how you measure democracy. Let's say.
What I mean is this Arrow's impossibility theorem. It says that like ideal democracy with some basic principles of democracy is impossible, right? To be rational, to have an order of preferences, and at the same time to meet some minimum criteria of democracy. And usually there's a trade-off between stability and democracy. If the EU is more stable, it's probably also because it's less democratic. And this, what you just mentioned, of these powers of the European Commission, powers of agenda setting, and this makes the European Commission, in a sense, like the dictator that gives stability to the system. So what do you think about it? Why Italians, they like democracy so much? They like proportional representation and some aspects of democracy that are at the same time have the price of instability.
Now, this is actually very okay. From this perspective, is very interesting, because I think you're perfectly right in saying that the degree of institutionalization, let's call it, of decision making in the European Union, it makes for a rather strong status quo bias, and therefore as a result of that, you give a lot of power to the agenda setter of those actors which generally are more recalcitrant to modify a policy. So that is undoubtedly the case. That is clearly the degree of institutionalization, or let's call it the corner in the trade-offs from the Arrow impossibility theories, the aspect about the dictatorship element. It plays an important role in Europe, undoubtedly. And on the other way around, instead, talking about Italy that you mentioned, clearly there, where especially as a result of generally particularly accommodating electoral laws, and particularly several cleavages operated at different level, because there are very strong left and right and north-south cleavages, for instance, in Europe, that in Italy, that leads to generally a more fractionalized party system, which as a result of that generates greater instability, essentially. So it is, let's say, greater accessibility to preferences, which leads to higher level of instability. So in a way, you're right. Let's say the inclination to allow greater preference representations leads to greater instability. which is at the core of the Arrow impossibility theorem. While in the European Union, one would have to say that undoubtedly the greater rules, institutionalizations, leads to a greater degree of policy stability. However, can I just add something to that? It is important. I mean, over the past few years, a decade or so, there's been quite a few studies that they try to analyze the responsiveness of ministers and EU institutions to national public opinion. And they do show that both the preferences, the positions that ministries express at the European level, as well as the policies themselves that are adopted at European level, they are responsive to national public opinion. So even though you're perfectly right in saying that the institutional design has a strong status quo bias, there is a certain degree of responsiveness, which is not trivial operating at the European Union level. So in my view, no, we shouldn't always necessarily look at the negative things there.
So the status quo bias would be in favor of the more reluctant member states, but at the same time, the status quo bias favors the fact that the European Commission can be more independent because it's more difficult to rein it in if it drifts, right?
Exactly. So exactly, I know I pick what you said just now because what are the risks of delegation in a way? So essentially, indeed, you delegate powers because you want to benefit from leadership, from expertise, from credible enforcement, you reduce your workload. But there are risks associated to delegation. The one you said is the most traditional one. Let's say that you have, you confer power about bureaucrats, but bureaucrats are not necessarily one would call perfect agents. Okay, they're not our clones. They're not the clones of ministers. Okay, they are. Most of them are politicians now, clearly in the College of Commissioners, but within the Commission, those are public officials that they have their views, they have their preferences, they have their policy bias. And so the potential consequences of conferring powers upon bureaucrats is that they might drift. The concept of drift is the risk associated with delegation. Essentially, you give power to a bureaucrat, and then it is very difficult to control what it does, because there might be legislative procedures that make it difficult, arduous, exactly because of the status quo bias, that makes it very difficult to modify the mandate that you have of the policies, of the powers that you have conferred upon the bureaucrats. And therefore, the bureaucrats, let's say, it's free to drift. Drifting means it would implement a policy that is closer to his own preferences and views than the original intent of the legislator. Okay, so the risk of bureaucratic drift is the major, let's say, probably one of the most risk of delegating powers at the supranational level, at the bureaucrats generally. And normally the potential for drift, the potential for bureaucratic drift increases the more, let's say, legislators are needed. So the more legislators are needed to modify the initial mandate to the bureaucrats, or the more divided is the legislature. Okay, so the more polarized the legislators become, if powers has been delegated to a bureaucrats, let's say, has greater room of maneuver, and therefore those are the risks associated with delegations. Clearly, it's one of the most important ones. Having said that, I mean, legislators are not oblivious to the risk of bureaucratic drift. They are aware that bureaucrats have their own policies, and if they're not sanctioned, they are likely to drift towards their own ideas if they have the power to do so. And as a result of that, legislators do adopt a bunch of, let's say, strategies not all of them successful, not all of them credible, but at least they try to adopt a bunch of strategies which are called in the literature control mechanism, which are adopted in order to minimize at least a little bit this risk of bureaucratic drift. I mean, clearly the appointment procedure, you tend to appoint a commissioner or a commission that is more or less representative of the views, of course, of the Council of the European Parliament. Clearly, however, especially if you are just limited by the very limited censure procedure that operate at the European level, that is not enough, clearly. I mean, appointment is not, let's say, a credible enough mechanism to rein in the Commission. So there are many other alternatives. There are also many other tools which are adopted by the legislatures in order to oversee what the Commission does. By far, apart from the budget, but by far the most common one are what are called procedural constraints. Essentially, legislators insert into EU law a bunch of procedures in order to make sure that there's not too much bureaucratic drift from the Commission. And there is a very large variety of these procedures. Some of them are consultation requirement, reporting requirement. Some of them are called with this very, let's say, Brussels terminology that emerges, which is called comitology procedure. But apart from the name which has been invented, but essentially what they are control mechanisms. They are mechanisms which have been adopted by the Council, so by ministers, and now they are also used in conjunction with the European Parliament in order to oversee what the Commission does when it has been implemented important powers.
Okay.
And just to conclude, those are actually being, these mechanisms are being now included in the Lisbon Treaty. So the delegated instruments, the implementation instruments in the delegated treaties really are exemplifies this idea of conferring power and exercising control from the Council and the Parliament on what the Commission does.
So in your book on executive politics, you mentioned this difference, like control ex post, right? It's like with new legislation, for instance, it's difficult in the EU. So the governments, the parliament, who are afraid of this bureaucratic drift already take preventive measures, like with this comitology oversight procedures, right?
Exactly, because it is so difficult. Exactly because it's not easy to adopt new laws. So it is, which means it's very hard to modify the mandate that confer powers to a bureaucrat, because it's not easy to adopt new laws, clearly. So what you do, you insert ex ante into the law already this sort of control mechanism. Yeah. Yes.
Okay, so this difficulty of creating new laws, it is related to this idea of the joint decision trap, right?
Exactly, because it is related to the idea that there are a bunch of legislatures that confer power, and then those power cannot easily be taken back. And hence, as a result of that, the sanctioning via the modification of the law is not particularly credible. So what you rely on different avenues. Especially, it is not particularly credible, especially because in the European Union context, the agenda setter is a commission. So it is a commission itself that has to make a proposal to limit its own power. So one would expect that it is not something that we would not expect to occur very frequently. However, when you talk about that, you see the emergence of agencies, and the agencies, in my view, it's because they do emerge because new policies has to be adopted, crises have to be faced, like the mad cow disease or the refugee crisis. So there are a bunch of crises that has to be solved at the supranational level, the Eurozone crisis, and so on and so forth. Okay, and since in order to deal with those crises, a significant amount of powers have to be delegated at the supranational level. And since probably there is increasing, let's say, I wouldn't say mistrust, but let's say caution in the delegation, in empowering too much the Commission. That is how essentially, in order to deal with these problems, legislators over time have tended to rely more on agencies. So you have the the Medical Evaluation Agency, the European Food Safety Agency, and so on and so forth, all the banking agency, which have expertise, but also that allow member states and also the parliament a little bit to exercise a bit more control in the execution of those measures, especially if you look at the governing boards of many of those agencies, which include essentially member states' representatives. So agentification is also a tool utilized in order to control a little bit what the Commission does, okay, to keep the Commission in check and to give a bit more oversight powers to member states.
Okay, so I'm really thankful for this because what you just discussed has helped us clarify one question that the students will have to answer this week. Every week we've got one lecture and one seminar with one question, right? And I think you just helped answer this question, right? Students will have to research about it, but I think you said is very, very valuable and to the point. We've got many questions from the students on YouTube. We've got an average of 45 students have been watching us live on YouTube, and they've got many questions. You can see now the chat there that many of those questions are being posted. I will try to read some of those questions for you. Not all of them. It will be impossible, but maybe some of them. Okay. One of the questions is about how leaders prioritize the agenda. If they give all the power of agenda setting to the Commission, or they just set some priorities, how can they frame these powers of the Commission?
This is an excellent question. Thank you very much, because this is a very excellent question. In order to answer that question, I would recommend to read an article written by Amy Kreppel, published on Comparative Political Studies. Amy Kreppel and her colleague, whose name now escapes me, I apologize for that. What they actually try to analyze, to deal with that specific point. Where does let's say the agenda emerges? And they do find very interesting that the conclusion of the European Council meetings, the manifestos adopted by the European parties during the European elections do inform a lot of the policy proposals of the Commission. So in a way, there is the Commission is not unresponsive to the demands from ministries, from the conclusions that normally they reach at the European Council meetings, and they are not unresponsive to the let's say a policy proposal that they normally put down on their electoral manifestos. So it is true that let's say, constitutionally speaking, the Commission has the power to set the agenda, but those specific proposals, they do emerge from political actors that they make political requests, being their ministers or parties, leaders in the party, in the parliament, and so on and so forth. Sorry, there's a bit of a noise here. So which is in a way good for democracy, in a way, because the Commission is a bureaucracy, but they do pay attention to parliamentary manifestos and opinions of ministers.
Another question that has been posted is whether bureaucracies slow down the policy-making process, or it's the opposite. From your presentation, it seems that bureaucracies are more agile, but the student asks if multi-level governance is possible, having in mind that bureaucracies tend to slow down politics.
Well, I think it is, I mean, the term bureaucratic, it is a synonym of slow procedural process. The reason why it is slow and procedural is exactly because legislators want it to be like that. So it is because legislators, when they give powers to those actors, they do give powers, but they also set a bunch of detailed constraints on what they should not do. And now if they have to do something, how they have to do something. So in a way, bureaucracies operate slowly because politicians want them to operate slowly.
So it's like bureaucracies are more agile, but they are made slow by the lawmakers that are afraid of them being too agile, right?
Exactly. And by the way, they want them to pay attention to specific groups. So they ask them, no, for instance, you want to adopt specific rules and regulations, you need to consult interested parties. So there has to be a specific consultation process if you want to adopt specific executive measures. So they are slow because they are demanded by the legislators to be slow. Having said this, however, let me just this is one part, let's say, of the one side of the argument. When there are big crises, when there are serious crises, well, that is when bureaucrats play a crucial role. When they have to intervene, if they have the powers, when they have to intervene. So the classical example would be the ECB, right? The European Central Bank, which is in a way also clearly a bureaucracy. Well, in situation of big crisis, even though they are limited by the mandate, they are crucial. They are the one that have to intervene swiftly to deal with major issues. So both of the things, depending on the conditions, sometimes bureaucrats have to be assertive, immediate, and fast, especially when there are things such as financial crisis.
There's also a related question to what you just said, posted by my favorite student from Moldova. And he mentioned the current challenge of inflation in Europe. And you just mentioned that the ECB is a bureaucracy. You also mentioned that the ECB has a mandate, right? By a mandate to keep prices stable, right? And the question is, you said that in times of crisis, the bureaucracy can help you get out of the crisis. The question is, can it really help, or was it the ECB who created the current inflation by printing too much money?
Well, that can be probably, let's say, an unwanted consequences of their prior policies. Clearly, we face major problems. Imagine the following one. Clearly, the major one was the Eurozone crisis, but after that also clearly the pandemic. The pandemic was a major, another major crisis. And keep in mind, I mean, I want to emphasize, those are not just small crises with a small c. Those are capital C crises. The Eurozone and the financial crisis is an event that occurred, was so big that normally occur once in a century. The pandemic, it happened also once in a century. The previous one was the Spanish flu, even though I know that is a misnomer because it was not, it's only because of the freedom of the press in Spain, which was called the Spanish flu. But those are major crises, okay? So those are capital C crises. So clearly the intervention of the ECB in this context was massive. And as a result of that, now we have another major crisis, by the way. Of course, the war in Ukraine has another major crisis with all the cost push inflations related to the Ukrainian crisis. So this is a third major crisis. So undoubtedly, you're right. Clearly, the behavior of the ECB might have led to inflationary pressures. combined undoubtedly with the domestic expansionary fiscal policies. In my view, like as any other political system, like in the US, gradually we will have to, on the one side, the ECB will take slowly a tighter monetary positions, and next year it is very likely that the excessive deficit procedure, all the regulatory system that underpin the European economic policy, from the European semester, but also the excessive deficit procedure, will start again, because now it's suspended, as probably people know. Now it's not in operation yet, so it will be suspended. It will start probably next year, probably after another review, and hence, let's say, probably some sort of greater control also on fiscal policy will start again, I would say. So there will be probably greater oversight of national fiscal policy, oversight which has not been there with the pandemic and now with the crisis in Ukraine. So those are issues, but they can be addressed.
There's one question by my favorite student, another favorite student of mine from Moldova, Rodica, and she asks about a phenomenon like Brexit, someone leaving the EU, if it's still a possibility that it will happen again, right? But I would like to adapt this question to your current discussion about the euro and supervision with the euro. This peer review system. Is it possible that the frugal states in the Eurozone, the more pro-austerity states, the ones with a lower debt, that they are the ones who threaten with leaving the common currency in order to enforce the discipline on the other countries? You say, this system with the Stability and Growth Pact, it doesn't work, sanctions are not applied, there's too much overspending, the ECB is too lenient on the undisciplined member states, right? It's bailing them out, buying their debts, monetizing the debt. But what we have, even if we are in a minority politically, because now most of them are in crisis, we could leave the common currency, and what would happen?
Well, I mean, that is a nuclear option in a way. In my way, that I'm not sure whether that is a particularly credible strategy, because there are other tools available. Oh, sorry. Okay. Oh. Can I continue? Okay, Diego, can I continue? Okay. I know, sorry, because we were hearing you talk. So essentially, what you're suggesting that the so-called frugal state can implement, whether this so-called frugal state can use the threat of leaving the Eurozone and probably creating their own monetary union as a credible threat on the other states. I don't think this is a particular, apart from the legal intricacies and difficulties of doing that, which is enormous. And as a result, I'm not sure as to whether that is a credible threat vis-a-vis the other states. But more than anything, I think that they have other tools they can use. I mean, clearly, it is they need to build coalitions. It is they need to, as much as the other states, they say, these decisions, they need to form a group of states, a group of positions that might modify or avoid from modifying specific laws. So in my view, these so-called these frugal states, they have other options at their disposal in order to influence what is done clearly at the European level. First of all, they can attach conditions to spending. They can try to influence the behavior of the ECB via the possibility of the appointment of the actors within the ECB. They might have veto power within the legislative process when proposals are put forward in order to modify the European economic framework. So, in my view, those states, they have many other credible options to make sure to exercise control on those specific issues. So I don't think that is a particularly credible option, but because there are other options which are available. And bear in mind that as the system is designed now, I think it is more in line with the views of these states, first of all, and second, if they want to modify, there are proposals probably coming up in modifying the economic governance framework. Now, for them, it's probably easier to create some sort of a minimum winning veto coalition, and their views, in my view, are likely to be accounted and taken into account.
Okay, we've got many other questions, but I don't know how much time you have left for us. But we've got some questions that are related to one another, and the current questions, they're not specifically about delegation or executive, but they can be. The question is about Ukraine. I know you are very sensitive about this problem in Ukraine, and it's also about energy policy in the EU. What can you tell us about these issues, generally speaking? There are different questions, but all of them, they are about the same idea of the problem in Ukraine, the problem with energy, and if there's something the EU can do about it, or why it's not possible.
Okay, we're veering a little bit away from the topic of the lecture, but let me tell you this. I think Europe has a major role to play, hopefully a positive role, but in my view, it has a major role. It has a major role on different dimensions, in the sense that of being a magnet to attract and facilitate the process of democratizations of Eastern neighbors. And the way to use that magnet is by opening up markets, offering people living in these countries greater economic opportunities and opportunities to grow economically, but also opportunities to live in open and liberal countries, essentially. So, and he has the tool to do that, and he has the tool, also the financial resources to do that. More on the economic side, a little bit less on the military side, because clearly it is not particularly, is less effective on that specific side. So in my view, it can be an actor for positive liberal reform in Central and Eastern Europe. And I think he has to use that. I mean, that is my personal view. I think he has to use that power in that specific way. In terms of energy prices, the way I interpret these things is that well, this is a crisis, and let's use this as an opportunity. Because to tell you the truth, no, clearly there is an important crisis. I'm not underestimating whatsoever the gravity of what's happening in Ukraine, but the crisis that we're facing in terms of higher energy costs, it should be exploited as an opportunity to speed up even more our transition towards low carbon emission economies. So we are facing a major global crisis, which is environmental crisis. So let's use this one in order to proceed with more decisive step towards really decarbonizing European economies. And I think that's important as a European to do that and to be the leader in doing that, because we've been the leader in poisoning our environment. I mean, industrial revolution started in Europe in the late 18th century, and then we have different waves of industrial revolution. So we have been major contributors to global warming. I think this should be the opportunities to us to be the major leader in decarbonization. So in my view, that is really an opportunity that we should exploit and really be the leader on that across the globe. Because many other countries, and by the way, rightly so, many other countries, they've not contributed historically to global warming. So for them, we can, say, probably they might have, rightly so, a greater room of maneuver in doing so, but we have to be the leaders, in my view, to lead in the environmental transition, so to decarbonization. So that is an opportunity, in my view.
Is that like a Catholic position? It's like a sense of guilt for what your sins in the past, and that you have to do some penance now, because in the US it was different, when they said with Donald Trump, and they said, how can I agree to this climate treaty if I am sitting on a country that is full of oil and other energy resources?
But can I ask you something? I mean, this is not about delegation, but I think we should stop thinking about the fact that trying to develop a a low carbon emission economy is necessarily economically costly. Now there is significant evidence of what is called decoupling. So countries which are growing economically but reducing their carbon emission. So that is the path that we should pursue. And that actually would destroy that sort of argument, because the argument is, it is very costly to decarbonize, and so we have to pay a very strong economic cost in order to decarbonize. Well, that doesn't necessarily be the case. It's not necessarily the case. It is possible to grow and to become, let's say, a wealthier economy and an economy that offers opportunities without necessarily emitting more CO2 in the environment. So that is possible. Decoupling is a possibility.
I have a question for my students. What's the temperature like today in Yash? Because I think it's very cold today. I saw the pictures, I saw the snow, my question for you, that you are watching live, tell us what the temperature is now. And my question for you, Fabio, do you think that we could heat up Yash with renewable energies, like wind energy or solar energy? Or you think that we should consider, as the French propose, nuclear energy as a green energy?
Okay, this is not about delegation, but anyway. In my view, nuclear energy should not be ignored. I've written an article on nuclear energy. I mean, I written a chapter in a book and also an article on attitude towards nuclear energy across Europe, and also analyzing nuclear energy in Italy, because they tried it twice and they failed. I mean, at the beginning, 1960 was a leader actually in the development of nuclear energy, and then they just stopped and terminated the program. In my view, why should we ignore an energy which is safe, continuous, and environmentally, I wouldn't say it is. It has clearly some environmental consequences. I'm not saying that it's necessarily environmentally neutral, because no, the difficulty of managing waste and so on has implications. But it is clearly better than alternative energies. I know there's been a debate in Europe about classification of energies, but in my view, nuclear energy should be an option that facilitates this transition towards low carbon emission economies.
This was a difficult question that
This was a difficult question, well beyond my expertise.
Yes, but it just so that you feel in family. They are telling us it's 2 degrees today in plus 2 degrees in Yash, and my question is so that you understand that the European Union is very large, right? It goes from the Atlantic coast to the most eastern part in Yash. I am on the Atlantic now. They are on the other extreme. The temperatures are different, and it's sometimes difficult for us in Europe to agree on a common policy for such different situations in different countries. Certainly, yes.
Can I answer that? Going back to the idea of delegation in a way, okay? This is a very important issue, because if, let's say, powers to build energy infrastructure were delegated at the supranational level, because they're still very much national competencies, one would probably be able to create a pan-European energy infrastructure which is much, much more efficient than what we are having now. Energy policies, especially investment in infrastructure, is still in my view, too national, and there are so we have been discussing about having a common energy market for many, many years, but clearly building infrastructure is crucial. And in my view, Europe should really play a leading role in this as well, because creating a European-wide intelligent energy infrastructure, whereby let's say, if you do not have light in Vilnius, you can actually buy the energy produced by solar panels in Porto, right? In a way that is easy, feasible. And that is what we should do. I mean, improving the energy, the infrastructure of the energy generation and sale across the continent is fundamental. And the reason why this has been very hard is because powers to invest in infrastructure are really, I mean, the tools that are available at the supranational level are there. They give some incentive to invest in interconnection and so on, but they're still very limited. Energy policy, there's still very much a dominant national dimension, and that still lead to a rather fragmented European market. And that what is the serious implication is that there are, in my view, there are opportunities to exploit efficiencies, to generate efficiency in the generation and distribution of energy across the continent, which should be exploited, but they are not there because those powers are not being centralized. In my view.
Yes, one final question. I promise this is the last one. What's the outlook for the future? We're in a very deep crisis now. It's an economic crisis, a global one, but it's also for Europe. It's also a political crisis, and I think it probably will get worse in the coming years. But do you think that Europe, like in the past, will come stronger out of this crisis?
Well, there is a very common saying that you're aware of, that that Europe is born out of crisis. So you need a crisis to develop new instruments. Okay, I do not see how now it should be different from the past. So the challenges that we are facing, and this winter will be tough. Undoubtedly, will be a very tough winter. These challenges that we are facing, let's say, European politicians will have to deal with them, and they will try to adopt, when it is possible, common measures at the national level to address those problems. I'm generally optimist in a way, probably naively so, but from the experience, generally, probably not satisfying everybody. Some part of society pay more than others, but broadly speaking, European politicians are responsive to these things and try to, with mistakes undoubtedly, but they try to address the big issues that they face at the continental level. So generally speaking, my conclusion is optimist in the sense that the major crisis that we will face, and probably the one concerning environment and energy, are the crucial one. And the third one, clearly very important, is to guarantee some sort of a long-standing safety, let's say security structure at the continental level, because there is a war. The war is a sign that the previous system of managing, the previous security system of Europe didn't work very well if we are facing a war in our continent. So that is another major challenge, which the European Union can contribute in my view. Along with other organizations, clearly NATO and so on, clearly, but it can contribute on that dimension as well. So I'm not a pessimist, because European politicians tend to be responsive, and they try to dealing with all the difficulties and distributing the cost associated with these decisions. But generally, they come up with some sort of unacceptable solutions to these issues.
So this is a good opportunity to bring the lecture to a close on that positive, optimistic note about the future, that it's the crisis that force sometimes politicians to agree on new integration steps, and perhaps this crisis will be no exception. Thank you very much, Fabio Franchino, for your participation today in our lectures. On my behalf and on behalf of our students at Alexandru Iancuza University in Iași, it's not the first time that you participate with us, but I think this is going better and better. Thanks everyone for watching, for writing on the chat, writing questions. If you want to watch this later, you can also write questions in the comment sections below. Thank you very much, Fabio, once again, and see you soon.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you.